This is about starting this session, this morning session. A bit tired because yesterday we have a lot of job. And afterwards, a dinner with our international guests. So took some time to rest. But anyway, I would propose you all to sort of reestablish the idea of debating like we tried to do yesterday afternoon. Remember in the economic session, the session devoted for economic perspectives of gig economy. We had at that time, I think we sort of started to people being and feeling themselves comfortable to make questions and to express themselves. So this is what I was trying to propose you for this morning session, okay? Just to wake up totally. And we're going to start? Right? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Before we start our agenda for the day, we'd like to make two quick announcements for the postgraduate students to sign the attending list for today and yesterday, if you did not sign yesterday. And for the ones that were not present yesterday, please sign also the attendance list. It is with me. Just look for me at the end of the session, please. So good morning to you all. Welcome to the second day of the Gig Economy Seminar. We'd like to start by thanking Universidade de São Paulo, Tawil Shecker, and Maya Brown Law Firm, the coordinators of this event, Professor Mr. Freitas, Elizabeth Tippett, and the organizer executive, Adriana Calvo. We would like to thank Ordem dos Advogados do Brasil and all the authorities here present. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass to Professor Freitas for this first session. Please, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we're going to pass along to you the microphone.
Okay, again, good morning, everybody. Well, I was just trying to tell you that this morning session will be devoted to sort of provoke debates, questioning, and comments and everything you want. So feel yourself welcome to express yourself and to make questions. I have a couple of things, some very short remarks to open this morning, but I would like you to feel comfortable. So Adriana, just take a seat with me. You're gonna help me to make everything wake up. Well, before my short opening remarks, I would like to make an additional announcement that it was, for me, I was very proud when I went back home yesterday night. I received by the conventional mail service a book that is being launched by Henrique Zanin. Some of you probably have had the opportunity to meet him. He was a very talented student of the University of São Paulo grad studies program. It was master program, mastership. And well, it's one of the most interesting dissertation that I've been honored to supervise. In the dissertation panel, we had the presence of my dear friend, professor from the University, Catholic University of São Paulo, yes, the Pontificia, Flávia Piovesan. Well, the issue and the title is Fleeing Persecution, a study on LGBTQI asylum in Europe and Germany. That's a very interesting one. When we think about asylum, when we think about what's going on in some other countries with the LGBT people, we have to be aware of the importance of to take this issue seriously. Incredibly, nowadays we're still facing persecution, we're still facing intolerance, persecution with LGBT people in countries like Russia, some of the Eastern Europe countries, and some of the African countries also. So this is a very important agenda, and I just would like to say that now it's being available. It was edited by Arraiz Editora, but it's also totally in English. It was written in English, but it's very easy to be to be in touch with. So I'm very proud to announce you this. Well, let me. I was sort of trying to find out what should be the central idea, the strength idea of this morning session. I remember a very well-known assertion with one of our best fictionist writer. There's something like frogs doesn't jump because they are pretty, but because they have to. Sapo não pula por belezura, mas por precisão. That is to say that, well, why we are so worried about regulating gig economy. Are we addicted to regulate? I mean, are we supposed to regulate all kinds of economic and social phenomena? Why do we regulate, I think? And what are the purpose of regulating gig economy, specifically in what concerns with the platform work, the platform intermediator? And it's very important because there are some economic phenomena that we don't want to regulate. They don't need to be regulated because they are naturally healthy for economy and for society. But there are other phenomena that must be regulated, that must be submitted to some public control, because they are, at least theoretically, able to cause damage for social and economic well-being. So this is the central idea I would like to start proposing to you. The other thing I would like to stress, to highlight is why on-demand work, on-demand platform work, why does it matter? Why is it so important in the sense that all around the world, we, in different meetings, in different sessions, in different opportunities, scientists, social researchers, legal researchers, economists, as we saw yesterday afternoon, are concerned about the on-demand platform work. I have some hypotheses to explain or to answer this question. The first one is that this sort of phenomenon, it's very surprising for us in the sense that the phenomenon is a sort of awkward effect over our traditional way to rule, traditional way to supervise, traditional way to regulate employment and work relationship in general. So this is just a hypothesis, but anyway, as we could see yesterday in the morning, especially in the afternoon sessions, everybody is very concerned about it. It's a phenomenon that is sort of able to make us think about to what extent we still have effective tools to regulate employment and labor relationship. To what extent our labor law, our labor and employment law, to use the North American nomenclature. Our labor and employment law is still able to fit and to match up with the challenges of the nowadays employment and labor relationship. Well, so turning back to what is so important, a first line of responses is related with the very fast growth of the intermediation business through platforms. Very fast growth, very rapid one. In just a few years, companies like Uber, Lyft, even MTurk, no, there are a lot of different companies, good, well-succeeded companies, just to name a few, that very surprisingly, they soon took off. They surprisingly grew so fast and so importantly that we started to observe to what extent this growth could be explained in an economic health environment. In other words, is everything okay with this growth? Is it natural? Is it predictable? Is it something that we have to celebrate? Or is something that we have to be aware of? In the sense, specifically what regards employment and labor relationship. In fact, the fast growth of the platform business suggests that we are facing an economically disruptive phenomenon, to use the well-known word. Is it exactly, would it be properly and precisely disruptive? The idea of a disruptive economic phenomenon was first developed by Clayton Christensen in a very well-known article published in the Harvard Business Review. It's about 15 or 20 years ago. And facing specifically the Uber phenomenon, Christensen, with Rayner and McDonough in 2015, published another article, which is entitled, "What is Disruptive Innovation?" 20 years after the introduction of the theory. We visit what it does and doesn't explain. I'm sorry, I'm going to quote it because I think I must be precise in sharing with you his own words. He said, Christensen, he said in 2015, a disruptive innovation, by definition, it starts from one of those footholds. But Uber did not originate in either one. It is difficult to claim that the company found a low-end opportunity that would have meant taxi service providers have overshot the needs of a material number of customers by making cabs too plentiful, too easy to use, and too clean. Neither did Uber primarily target non-customers, people who found the existing alternative so expensive or inconvenient that they took public transit or drove themselves instead. Uber was launched in San Francisco, a well-served taxi market, and Uber customers were generally people already in the habit of hiring ride. Uber has quite arguably been increasing total demand. That's what happens when you develop a better, less expensive solution to a widespread customers need. But disruptors, say Christians and disruptors start by appealing the low-end or unserved customers, and then migrate to the mainstream market Uber has gone in exactly the opposite direction, building a position in the mainstream market first and subsequently appealing to historically overlooked segments. So it's the idea of being disruptive is the idea of what happened with the, do you remember Xerox machine? When came to be available, the press, the printer, the ordinary printer that we have nowadays, it was totally disruptive. Why it was disruptive? Because these service and this machine, well, this being was turned out to be able to be accessible to everybody, to different people that was not accessible before. In other words, a disruptive economic phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that brings to the market, to the customers, different people there were, or there had been so far alleged of this access. Well, let's go to some other very general and provocative remarks I tried to jot down for this morning session. Another line of attention relates to the challenges posed by the platform business in terms of regulation, particularly legal regulation. So what should be the obstacles to regulating business and intermediating work through digital platforms? Why is it so difficult? What is the problem? What are the obstacles that we can highlight faced by the platform business? From an urban planning point of view, urbanistic point of view, the difficulties seem to be, at least for me, to be related with a huge amount of strategic data on the business that is not made available to the public authorities. The platform don't make available data, very strategic data that the public authorities need to have access in order to plan and in order to execute public intervention, public policies. For example, how many vehicles were brokered by a platform in, for instance, the last 2 hours? How many vehicles were intermediated by the platforms? What are the algorithm sources of measuring the traffic rate on the basis of which the prices of rides are set? So the platforms say the prices are fixed according to some rates of traffic density. But what are exactly the sources that the platforms use to identify exactly what are the rates of traffic density? This is not available, which means it's difficult for the public authorities, as they are interested in planning and executing public policies in what regards with urban interventions. These data are not available, and it makes public interference, public policies very difficult. On the other hand, when it comes to regulating the work intermediated by these platforms, what is our field of research, basically, the legal tools traditionally provided by labor law, labor and employment law, don't seem to dress up this type of relationship. They seem to be unable, the traditional labor law tools, they seem to be unable to provide labor and social security protection on the workers intermediated by platforms. And why it seems to be this way, unfortunately? Because, well, some of the traditional tools like maximum working hour limits, the maximum of working hour limits, jornada máxima autorizada, or minimum wages and other important markers of standard employment relationship, what the economists call CER, standard employment relationship, don't seem to make sense in these new work arrangements, because it doesn't seem to make sense, because this sort of work arrangement is not established by fixed amount of hours. What we have traditionally noted in the tradition employment relationship, like jornada de trabalho, just a certain fixed amount of hour that ordinarily are submitted to work and that are relevant for the employment relationship. It's totally different in this sort of labor or employment arrangements. In addition, the phenomenon of work intermediated by platforms, contrary to what was exposed 6 years ago, approximately, it's not an arrangement for work in the sharing economy, as we are used to say, as we are used to classify. Clearly, what we see in this economic phenomenon and social phenomenon is a sort of phenomenon that more clearly is related to what we call it here, gig economy. That is to say, an economy or an economic sector that is very marginal, and as Professor Wilson said yesterday, in the bottom of the pyramid of the labor market. Well, in other words, precarious work. Precariousness, again, is one of the remarkable characteristics of our labor and employment relationship nowadays. As I said at yesterday meeting, this classification is not just a construction of a legal doctrine or a political assertion. The classification, on the contrary, when we assume that the on-demand work intermediated by platforms is situated in the geography and the social and political geography of the gig economy, we affirm that this phenomenon requires regulatory intervention by the public authorities. It's not a matter of we want to regulate. The public authorities intend to regulate because they are used to regulate all the economic phenomena. But because this specific phenomenon occurs in a field, an economic field, and social field that can possibly produce harms, social and economic harms. And so this is the reason why the public authorities are called to intervene, are called to take care of this phenomenon. It comes back the question of why regulate, what we intend to pursue by regulating. In other words, a kind of a temporary growth opportunity that precedes regulatory intervention by the public authorities. Let me just quote another author that, well, his name is almost impossible to be pronounced, but it's Sundararayan, Aaron Sundararayan. He has been proposing a sort of a, I would say, a moratorium by means of which, during a certain amount of time, we could, the public authorities could pay attention in the evolution of this phenomenon, and afterwards considering or reconsidering the convenience of intervening. The thing is, as soon as time goes, the possible and the tendential harm effects produced by this business, the platform business, can grow to proportions and achieve proportions that are socially and politically unbearable. In other words, we're talking about a phenomenon that challenges political authorities, as I said, local authorities in regulating the commuting system of transport, urban transport, and so on. Well, this is personally my opinion, but as I told you in the beginning of this session, this very short remarks are just a provocative perspective to make you wake up again and come to the discussion, come to the debate, and express your feelings and your perceptions and your fears about what we are studying and we are discussing about. Well, one of the greatest fiction writers, as I told, sapo não pula por belezura, mas pula por precisão. So frogs don't jump because they are pretty, but because they have to. So public authorities have to intervene, have to pay attention. And as the public authorities have to pay attention, we legal researchers are invited to devote a very qualified attention to this phenomenon. In other words, it's not a matter of academic preference. It's a matter of public interest that academy are invited to contribute. Regulating is particularly necessary. Regulating, what is the title of this seminar? Regulating. A regulation is particularly necessary in the face of a number of scenarios. The first one, essentially asymmetrical economic relations. We, in different sessions yesterday, highlighted the asymmetry, the asymmetrical relationship that characterizes the relationship between drivers and platforms, delivers and platforms. Very close to what we can identify in the traditional employment relationship. Second, the risk of producing undesirable social and economic effect, as I said before. Third, the need to agree on macroeconomic social mechanisms to cover events consistent of actual and presumed incapacity for work. I think also, again, Professor Wilson yesterday said, I'm very worried about, I'm very concerned about what will be the social scenario when these boys that we find driving and delivering in the evidence in the streets of São Paulo city nowadays, what would be the future of these boys and girls? It's not a problem. It's not a matter of individual option. This is what I intend to highlight. I want or I don't want to be protected, because the social protection, as far as we think about social security, and Marco Aurelio, it's here and could contest my opinion. The social agenda, the political agenda for social protection, for social security, is not an individual matter. It's a matter of political stability of the society, of the democracy. In other words, we mandatorily insert all types of economic activities in the system of the social security system, not because they opt in or opt out, but because to include these economic sectors in the social security system, it's necessary for political and democratic stability. 4, the need to ensure economic competition and fighting unfair competition practice. Again, turning back to the session, we discussed the economic outcomes of this phenomenon. Some of you should remember when I asked, it looks like something very close to a monopoly or oligopoly. Monopoly, yeah. Well, in other words, if when I started to research in this subject, when I went to the United States for this purpose, with this mission to research on this issue, I could realize that as some of the platforms come to some cities, they sort of turn out to be the only one. In some cities, like in Oregon, in Eugene, if I'm not wrong, Portland, but mostly Eugene, if I'm not wrong, the public authorities and the civil society neglected legitimacy for Uber, because they knew that Uber started as a not exactly a law-abiding company, not exactly a law-abiding company. So the civil society just say, we don't want Uber at all. We don't want Uber whatsoever in the city. And Lyft came. Lyft came, and Lyft dominated the market in that city. And this is what we can observe in different cities all around the United States and around the world. Like we see in São Paulo city, the delivery turned out to be turn out to be controlled by the iFood. So Uber Eats, it's out of the market. There is no competition. And if we celebrate market economy, we have to celebrate to be consistent with this value, to this political and economic value. We have to celebrate, and we have to stimulate competition. If we don't have competition, we don't have a market economy. We have something very different from what we are used to identify like healthy economic activity. The absence of competition, it's a very high pulsant sign of unhealthy economic phenomenon. Well, this is some provocative remarks. You know, to stimulate competition, this is what is in the core purpose of the Sherman Act. It was the first act devoted to regulate the health market phenomenon. So, but why the law, the most important economic law act, the Sherman Act, the Pioneer Act, why is devoted to stimulate competition? Because competition is in the core of the possibility to have options for consumers, but not only options for consumers, but also competition that brings innovation, that put the industry, the sense that the business, to put it forward, to make it develop, and to give back to the society some value. This is in the idea of economic market. And so, as I told, as you celebrate capitalist economy, you have to be committed with improving competition. Competition is, I would say, the first step for building a free economy or market economy, healthy and interesting for the society as a whole. Well, let's see. Well, I told you something about the idea of disruptive construction. And I have to, well, sort of trying to wrap up my presentation. It's not a sort of a presentation. It's just sharing you some anxiety or anxiety guiding issues. Should we suggest for public authorities a one-fits-all option in terms of identifying workers and platforms as making part of a employment relationship? Or should we suggest that this sort of relationship should be put at the side of the employment, the traditional, the classical, the typical employment relationship, and to put in a sort of a place, I don't know exactly where should be this place, but in some place that is devoted for independent contractor, like the North American say, or self employers, as the UK colleagues call it, self-employers. I think we should advise for the inconvenience to come out with a one-fits-all conclusion, one-fits-all decision. And why I think this way? Because well, traditionally, at least, probably it's a bias of some old labor and employment professor like me, but we are used to identify the nature of the relationship by means of trying to identify if there are the presence of some requirements to be able to classify it as employment relationship or not. In other words, this is not to do, nothing to do, there's nothing to do with the nature of the activity itself. As we know, for a long time, we can think about, like, for instance, lawyers that are employees and lawyers that are independent contractors, medical doctors that are employees and medical doctors that are independent contractors. So it's not the subject of the service itself that characterizes the nature of the relationship. The nature of the relationship should be identified by means of studying and paying attention case by case of the presence or not of the requirements of labor employment relationship. I'm not sure I'm clear enough about this point, but I'm afraid about what's going to happen with the decision of the predicted decision of our Supreme Court, as well as I'm afraid of some sort of way to react to the proposal from the government regarding the regulating this activity. I think we have to be committed with the fundamentals of labor law, which is the nature of the relationship should be identified case by case by the presence or by the absence of the typical employment predicates. Well, my dear friends, this is what I try to jot down just to cool or to hot this opening session of this morning. I would like you to sort of reestablish the climate of debates and questioning that we have on the afternoon session, yesterday afternoon session. So thank you for having me this morning again, and thank you for well, so carefully and so politely listen to my provocative, or at least I should. I was trying to be so provocative appointment. So, you want any considered? No.
Anybody has questions? If anybody has any questions, we have the microphone there.
But don't you just take the microphone, eh?
Because we are proposing a debate right now.
Yeah,
So go forward.
this is the idea. Excuse me.
Tô passando circulando os livros.
So feel free to make your speech very and committed with the idea of question and answer. So just say whatever you want and express your feelings about it. So, go ahead, Leticia.
Good morning. I want to ask you if it's possible to put every kind of activity in the same bag. For example, app and platform, drivers, delivery, micro task. Because, for example, when we study those people who works to Amazon Mechanical Turk, they are not located in any specific place. So how to regulate it? We need an international regulation, or is it possible to regulate it, for example, in Brazil? And is it enough to protect them? A local regulation is enough to protect them, or we need some a global perspective?
Wonderful question, Leticia. Wonderful and very up-to-date question. We have different types of platform intermediation. We have a first type of platform intermediation related with urban drives and urban deliveries. But we have a different one, as you quoted. The M-Turk is a paradigmatic example. But in the international literature, it's called crowd work. What is it? What is it all about? When you say crowd work, we're considering a phenomenon that is, as you said, global, widespread in different countries, in different continents, and are very far away from the possibility to be submitted to a state law regulation. In other words, if Brazil decides, the Brazilian representatives decides to regulate crowd work and enact some rules by, for instance, by minimum wage or stuff like that, it doesn't achieve the effectiveness, the expected effectiveness in this sort of intermediation, because the workers are widespread in different continents and submitted to different sovereign state law. This is why the formal general director of the ILO guide writer, if I'm not wrong, about 3 years ago, in by the meeting of the ministers of labor. Obviously, Brazil was outside of this meeting because we didn't have it by that time labor minister, as you remember. Well, he proposed to start reflecting, studying, and trying to draft some strategies to regulate this crowd work. And what is very interesting, Leticia, again, thank you for this question. It's a very important one. The crowd work is not only, though it's ordinarily devoted for no skilled activities. Like, for instance, we don't have any more typewriters, but we can digit, or something like translating, or stuff like that. No, crowd work is also in this ground basis, but also crowd work, Leticia, is related, like for instance, with surgery intervention, which is highly sophisticated and is sometimes guided by international connections between medical doctors located in one country and medical doctors that are executing the intervention in a different country. So the state law, the state legal system is not able to be effective regulating this sort of activity. And this is what is important to draw a line of division, or at least distinction, to be more precise, between the ordinary platform work and the crowd work. Crowd work is also intermediated by platforms like mTurk, but it's a different business, or at least it's a business that have different and further consequences and effects that go further than the possibilities of regulating within the state nation's legal system. Well, look, it's not question and answer. It's just feel yourself welcome to express. Oh, go ahead, please.
Talking about platform workers, considering the specifics of the activities. For example, they may not work at subordinate. If you look at each case individually, they can choose which app they're going to use and alternate them during the day as they see fit. But also considering that our federal constitution in the Article 7 does not guarantee the rights there only for employees, but for workers.
Yeah.
Of course, they are entitled to a protection.
Mm-hmm.
But in your opinion, what would be the legal structure that we should or could construct for these platform workers? There could not be employee because of the higher taxation. They do not want these higher taxations, but of course they cannot be disprotected.
Great question. But again, as I told you yesterday, it's not a matter of option. It's not a matter of self-identification. Being or not employed is a matter of fact. So we are supposed to look at carefully to the facts that are present in each relationship. But the most important part of your question is related with the nature of the legal system devoted to regulate work relationship. Furthermore, or beyond the employment, the strict typical employment relationship. Should we go towards suggestion for public authorities to start developing in Brazil a third category, like we have in UK, the worker, a sort of in between the employment relationship and what they call self-employer. Well, at first I thought it could be an interesting solution. At first, I have to confess that I was very, well, this is different from proposing a specific act to regulate or to provide some rights for some activities, like we have in different ones. No, it won't be the first activity that isolated have been regulated with some rights and the attribution of some rights and so on. But the thing is, would that be interesting for in order to bring this activity to formality, to bring this activity to be under the light of sun, you know, and to start to produce revenues, to pay taxes, and to be submitted to control. I'm trying I'm trying to, I'm not totally convinced about it, but I have a very strong feeling that probably it will work more favorably to stimulate precarization than to push to formality. And why is it for? The first guy that called me attention to this phenomenon, probably some of you already know, Jeremiah Prassel. I remember lunch. They have lunch talk in the United States in American universities, and we are in a lunch talk with Jeremiah. He was launching his book, Humans as Service. Yes, he's professor of the Oxford and Magdalen College and Oxford University, professor of labor and employment law, labor law in the UK. And I asked him, have you heard about the Hamilton Project? The Hamilton Project is a project developed by two senior scholars. Hamilton Project, Hamilton is a think tank that is located in New York City, was launched. Mr. Justice is around here probably. Back to the Hamilton Project. Was launched by Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, when he was probably still in the office. They proposed something like what they call it a dependent contractor. Should be an intermediate category between employment and independent contractor. But he told me, Jeremiah Prassel again, he told me when I asked him, have you heard about it? What are your impressions? What are your feelings about it? He told me back. Answering said, no, Antonio. It doesn't exactly, we're not sure it's something useful to formalize this sector of economy. And we are pretty sure that it doesn't avoid litigation. And this is the experience of UK. In UK, the high rates of litigation regarding classification litigation specifically was not blocked by the existence of this third alternative, this third possibility. So it doesn't work to avoid litigation. When I say avoiding litigation, it's not only, to have something established. I'm thinking about legal security. I'm thinking about predictability for investors, not only for workers. I'm not only thinking about social protection. I'm also thinking about obviously, to think about social protection, you have to think about the healthy business. And we cannot think about healthy business without some sort of legal security, predictability. It's part of the capitalist economy. And if it doesn't bring predictability, the existence of a third possibility to classify, what should be the reason we would opt for this, I say, very dangerous possibility? Because as we go, we make steps toward this, it's difficult to go back. I'm not sure I'm clear enough. As soon as you have this possibility legally accepted, legally established, it's politically very difficult. You have consensus to go back to the two possibilities, independent contractor or employment relationship, as we have in Brazil and as we have in the United States. This is what I mean with dangerous. So I know if I answered your question, but again, I'm trying to share with you my anxieties and my personal feelings about some of these questions. Obviously, I'm not convinced of all the things I'm telling you, totally convinced at least. But I have some strong feelings that, based on the experience of UK, based on the experience of different countries that have this third possibility, to classify the work relationship. And in UK, they call it work relationship. We have employment relationship, we have working relationship, and we have what they call self-employer. So back to the audience. Have time? No. She's telling me I spoke too much more than I expected to. So, friends, please.
Professor, I have one to ask you for you. I try to compare outsourcing, the effects of outsourcing and the gig economy, because I think there is two consequences. First, transaction costs. First, internal, because retirement is the option. And I believe in innovation, which is responsible for political and social instability. Internally, I believe the retirement cost is one. And when I think about the
transaction costs,
in the public support. I believe outsourcing in automakers is responsible for, in the United States, in my view, for right wing to support the Trump in US.
Sort of.
My question is possible to outsourcing and gig is an international phenomenon. It's possible to have one solution internally. Leticia asked the same question on. Is possible to have the regulation internally, or is necessary to global regulation for these effective results?
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid it's not possible at all. I wish we are able to regulate it internally, or at least mainly, if not totally internally, by means of internal provisions, legal provisions. But it's very difficult to imagine, like even this issue, specifically platform workers. Could you imagine if the Supreme Court in Brazil decided that this is not employment relationship, and the Supreme Court of California State, the state of California, say it's employment relationship? Could it be so? How would be, I would say, to be polite, how would be awkward and uncomfortable for the Brazilian Supreme Court to say exactly the opposite, what said the Supreme Court of the state of California, where the business started. Uber started in San Francisco. Could you imagine how it should be uncomfortable for Brazil to go straight in the opposite direction of the decisions and precedents of the North American courts? Just to give an example. But yes, we have to think about some sort of strategy to combine national state regulation, national legal regulation, national legal provisions with international one. This is the idea of ILO, International Labor Organization. Wait, what is the purpose? What is the mission of International Labor Organization? Basically, not only provide good researches and good support, technical support for governments, but also the normative dimension of ILO is devoted precisely to give some basic, some minimum labor standards to be able to provide effectiveness of the legal protection far beyond the boundaries of the nation state. So I'm not sure if I was clear. In other words, we have to avoid using cheap work as a source of competition. And this is the first idea of launching the International Labor Organization back to the 1919, back to the first tree of the wrapping up the First World War. Well, this is why for some decades I was devoted to research about globalization, which is more precisely pronounced, because well, as we have a globalization of the market and of the industry, we have to face the challenge also to a certain extent globalize legal protection. Any other question, please? Okay.
Good morning.
She's in the room. Okay.
Professor, in this complex scenario, I would like to hear you. What is your feeling or thoughts about the labor unions' responsibilities here in Brazil?
I think labor unions are trying to find a path to reestablish their legitimacy and capacity to put together workers and to represent them effectively. I'm afraid they have some challenges very difficult to be faced, such as, for instance, to what extent they represent what they call the agenda of the new social movements. The new social movements, or by means of new social movements, I mean the agenda of equity, of gender equity, the respect of LGBT rights, promoting rights regarding to leisure, regarding to cultural public opportunities, and so on, just to give them some examples. The representativeness of the old union movement is based upon class representativeness, class organization, workers and employers. But we have nowadays another different and so important agenda as the traditional one. Just to take to give a different example, the importance of the migration agenda, the human rights agenda, specifically devoted to migration. Migration, it's a very important and very central political issue currently in Europe, in the United States, and even in Brazil. Could the traditional agenda of the union workers face the challenge to offer response, appropriate response to these demands? I'm not convinced that they are prepared. I know we've been yesterday in the São Bernardo do Campo Union Workers Union, one of the most important and the most modern and very up-to-date unionism. But I confess you, they are still confined in the revolutionary static agenda. This is their ethos. And to think about different agenda, representative agenda, we have to rebuild the ethos of this unionism. And I think to a certain extent, it's a very difficult and a very, well, very far away from what we can foresee from what we are nowadays. Any other comments? So I would unfortunately have to finish my, unfortunately, because I would love to be with you in this dialogue, but we have other very prestigious, prominent guests to come to help us facing this so challenging subject as gig economy regulation and platform workers. So I think we have to call the next session. Apologizing for the little late.
Thank you all. Thank you, Professor, for these great insights. I hope you all enjoyed. I know I did. For this next session, we have the exposition of platform work and discrimination. We invite to join us as president of the session, the PhD and Master in Human Rights by the Universidade de São Paulo, professor of Universidade Federal do Paraná, and author of several books. Please welcome the Professor Marco Aurélio Serral Júnior.
As we get ready for the next panel, we're gonna now raffle some books we were circulating here. Okay, so we have the number of your enrollment in Simpla. So we're gonna tell a number and we're gonna raffle the books, okay? So I just need the books back because I need to do the raffle. E Adriana, vem aqui para pôr o pendrive da sua apresentação. Isso. Não mandou o pendrive, tá? Você tem como apresentação dela, ela mandou aqui.
Eu peguei o currículo aqui, acabei não separado aqui.
Mas como a gente vai colocar a apresentação dela aí, ela mandou no WhatsApp, você consegue abrir esse e-mail no computador?
Eu não sei colocar minha internet aqui. Sumiu.
Mas aqui já está na internet.
Ah, tá, beleza.
Então, deixa eu pegar a lista de participantes, lista de inscrição, tá aí? Que número você falou?
13.
So I asked him to say a number. We're gonna first raffle the book of Mr. Freitas, which is Work on Demand. And I asked him a number and he said number 13, Aline Paixão. Então pode, claro. Escolhe desses aqui. Eu quero. Adriana, another number. 7. So another number 7. 7 is Alessandra Menezes. Is she here? No. Another number. 27. 27 is Breno Souza. No. Another number. Rosana. 14 is Ana Cavalheiro. No. Another number. 17, Ana Paula Castelo Branco Costa. No. I'm gonna raffle another one. 120. 120, Patrícia Azevedo Lima. No. 50, 50. 50, Di Giovanni Mariotto. Ah, congratulations. Freire, the bookseller, he said he has some sales and promotions just for today. So he said in the break, if you could pass by him, he would be very happy. Another number? Now we're gonna raffle the book of Freitas, Direito do Trabalho e Populismo, de Vargas a Bolsonaro. Marcos Lima. No. Vou falar 113. Mona Lisa Simplício. No. 130. Raquel Bossan. No. 140. Rodrigo Chagas. No. 40. Cláudia Tejeda. Cláudia? Ah. Isso. Conseguiu por apresentação dela? No e-mail dele? Eu mandei, acho que não.
Mandei e-mail para mim, mas ainda não chegou.
Tá, tudo bem. Tendo mais um.
Assim,
Another book, Novas Formas Flexíveis de Trabalho, que esperar para o futuro. I was one of the coordinators here. It was another event, another seminar I coordinated. So, tá. Isabela Moraes Novo Duval. Ah, vale Okay. Ali, right? Ah, she's volunteering, helping us. Congratulations. And now the last book, my book, Manual de Direito e Trabalho, 8ª edição. A number? 90. So, José Olímpio Meyer. No? Luana Souto, 92. Ah, ok. Conseguiu?
Mas o doutorado foi mais fácil para o senhor. Que abriu.
No, it's not that difficult.
Eu mandei para mim o material, mas não chegou ali.
No. We try to manage. Você pega só uma coisinha, isso aqui, ó. Pega um papelzinho, por favor. Antes que seja um desastre. Esse
Esse é o meu e-mail.
O seu, você tem um PowerPoint?
Eu mandei para mim por e-mail e
Agora eu
WhatsApp,
mandei
mas eu
pro
não
seu
consigo
e-mail.
abrir.
Tá, você tá, onde que tá aqui você?
Acho que pode minimizar. Você tava, tinha uma tela toda.
Uhum.
Vou usar
Tinha,
aqui.
tá. Não, esse aqui é certo, esse é o
Não.
meu. Esse você tem que abrir no link, já tá aberto.
Não, mas eu já tinha até link para o e-mail.
Vamos começar com a apresentação da Vina primeiro,
Uhum.
ela está com a agenda.
Tá,
Ela me pediu, a
beleza.
Adriana vai depois.
Então, beleza. Tá, então já começo aqui.
Então, pode chamar a Vina, ela já está online. Deixa eu ajudar ele.
Só um minutinho que agora só vou.
Depois a gente...
Fala o currículo agora da Vina. Deixa eu se ela está lá. Você conseguiu pegar? A Adriana, eu vou pegando aqui.
Eu mandei para mim.
Hi, Vina. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
So we are ready to start. Okay.
Great.
So our chairperson, our chairman will start the panel. Chairman.
Good morning to everyone. I'm sorry for the technological difficulties. I have the honor of leading this panel 4 of this magnificent event coordinated by Professor Freitas, my dear friend, my dear teacher, and teacher Adriana Calvo. In this panel, we will have the participation of 3 brilliant teachers, Vina Dubal, Adriane Reis de Araújo, and my friend Ana Virgínia Moreira Gomes. Caiu o currículo aqui. Perdão. Teacher Vina Dubal is a professor in law, technology, and precarious workers. I'm sorry. Research focuses broadly on law, technology, and precarious workers, combining legal and empirical analysis to explore issues of labor and inequality. PhD, University of California, Berkeley, Jurisprudence and Social Policy. JD, University of California, Berkeley School of Law, BA with honors, Standard University, International Relations. Now, we have the privilege of listening the teacher, Vina Dubal.
Thank you so much. I'd like to share my screen, and maybe you can tell me if you can see my PowerPoint. 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Huh, it's not giving me the option to do my PowerPoint. I'd love to show you some of these pictures. That's okay. I'll give it without the pictures. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm sorry that I am not there in person. Thank you so much to Professor Freitas and to Adriana Calvo for inviting me, and to all of you for being here today. I'm especially grateful to you for doing this in English. It's somewhat shameful as a as an American that we're giving these talks in Brazil in English. Forgive me for my limited capabilities. One day I will learn Portuguese. Again, I'm very, very grateful for the invitation and for this important conversation during this critical time period in platform regulation. So on August 28th, 2020, the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, residents of downtown Oakland awoke to a prominent new billboard advertisement. On the corner of Broadway and Webster Street, directly above a popular lounge in the city's East African immigrant community, a large black and white advertisement read, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber." So several months into the global coronavirus pandemic that disproportionately killed African Americans, and amidst a historic summer of Black Lives Matter's protests prompted by the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, similar Uber billboards were erected in cities across the United States. The slogan, "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber," drew upon and cleverly appropriated the memorable #DeleteUber campaign launched by the New York Taxi Workers Alliance during the Muslim ban protests 4 years earlier. In solidarity with protesters and Muslim immigrant taxi, Uber, and Lyft drivers in New York City, the New York Taxi Workers Alliance had organized a work stoppage, a strike, at the John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City. Shortly thereafter, Uber's surge pricing directed drivers to the airport, resulting in algorithmically enabled strike breaking. This in turn outraged the Muslim ban protesters who advanced the New York Taxi Workers Alliance's call to #DeleteUber in the name of racial and economic justice. So 4 years later, Uber's "If you tolerate racism, delete Uber" marketing slogan was incomprehensible to many of its drivers. The morning after the billboard was erected in downtown Oakland, which is home to some of the most important Black Power movements and civil rights protests in US history, an Uber driver snapped a photo of the sign on his smartphone and messaged it in a group text. "What does this even mean?" the driver asked. For roughly 7 months, members of this primarily immigrant and people of color workforce had been organizing to prevent Proposition 22 from passing. Proposition 22 was an initiative that, in the context of the pandemic, threatened to take away the employment rights legally entitled to California platform workers and to codify a third category of worker. Most of these drivers had been laboring for Uber and its competitor Lyft for over half a decade. They had experienced the real-life impacts of continual wage cuts, black box algorithmic control, and misclassification as independent businesses. As the coronavirus pandemic ravaged their communities and drastically reduced ride-hail demand, many were forced to choose between risking exposure to the virus and hunger. Because of the company's misclassification, many drivers received tens of thousands of dollars less in jobless aid than they were owed. For African-American ride-hail drivers, the attempt to cloak the company in anti-racist politics was both confusing and infuriating. Economic justice, driver after driver told me, is racial justice. A coalition of drivers and drivers groups co-organized a protest in front of the Uber billboard. Masked, gig workers held up a countersign mirroring the font and aesthetic of Uber's billboard. It read, "If you support racial justice, vote no on Prop 22. Prop 22, the workers explained, was the most expensive ballot initiative in California history. And yet it would take away the basic economic rights that the California legislature and court had affirmed that these workers were owed, including the minimum wage, overtime protections, unemployment insurance, and reimbursements for expenses. And in sponsoring the initiative, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and Instacart had invested a record $203 million to campaign for, among other things, a differential wage code for the sector, which would effectively legalize piece payment for most of the app-deployed workforce. So Uber's billboard and the gig workers' protest made race visible as central not only to the proposition and the third category of work, but to the entire sector. In 2020, an estimated 70% of Uber and Lyft drivers in California were people of color and immigrants. And in 2019 in San Francisco, 78% of ride-hail and delivery workers were people of color. Over 70% worked more than 30 hours per week, and most relied on these jobs as their primary source of income. Some had no money left after considering their vehicle expenses. Perhaps prompted by these economic and demographic realities, the companies decided to address race head on. Uber launched not only the billboard I spoke about, but announced it was an anti-racist company in a blog post by CEO Dara Khosrowshahi. Excuse me. Lyft, for its part, unveiled Lyft Up, an initiative to provide donated rides to underserved communities while simultaneously displacing millions of dollars from public transportation that those communities relied upon. Many drivers in my research disavowed these company gestures. Their lives and racial identities, they insisted, were being instrumentalized for profit. So in November 2020, which was also the Trump election, or the election in which Trump lost, 9 months into the coronavirus pandemic, which disproportionately killed transportation workers and Black and Latinx essential workers, including food delivery and ride-hail drivers, Proposition 22 passed with a 58.6% voter approval rating, effectively creating a third category of worker and a differential wage code for a majority people of color sector in California. This is the first third category law in the US. Technology capitalists heralded the passage as a boon for innovation, an example of how new laws could, quote, catch up to the technological present and advance the future of work. This configuration, however, elided not just the impacts of the law for a highly racialized workforce, but also the historical roots of differential wage codes. Indeed, this was not the first time workers of color had been carved out of the protections of employment laws. Like Uber and Lyft, early 20th century industrialists had campaigned for differential wage regulations and even sectoral carve-outs for majority African American workforces. This is in the post-slavery era. And with this reality in mind, I think it's important to ask, how can we understand California's Proposition 22 and the third category of worker within the history and purpose of laws that have governed the past and will govern the future of workers? Rather than a statutory scheme that addresses inequality, I argue that it is a novel statutory scheme that exacerbates and entrenches racial and economic inequality, and that it draws on historical precedent. So following Charles Mills's call to engage in knowledge production through a color-conscious genealogy, and using legal and ethnographic methodologies, I situate Proposition 22 within the context of the long history of corporate battles over wage regulations in the US. And I reframe the third category of worker against the backdrop of racialized wage codes debated, passed, and proffered during the first and second New Deals. This is in the 1930s. And I should note that this framing comes from how workers themselves have thought about Proposition 22. So for example, a lead driver organizer with Rideshare Drivers United, which is one of the unions that I study, it's an informal group of self-organized workers, said to me, Proposition 22, plain and simple, puts all of us app-based workers in a second-class worker status permanently. Historically, who else hasn't been covered by the minimum wage? Domestic workers and farm workers, and now app-based workers. And just like domestic and farm workers, we are a majority of people of color and immigrant workforce. And somehow, people make up lies that it's okay for us to not have access to the same protections and wage floors as everyone else. Our slogan should be, if you tolerate racism, pass a third category law in your state. So taking these workers' comparisons seriously, I extended my very long research project comparing work law, technology, and worker organizing in the offline and online ride-hail and delivery work. And I turned to primary and secondary sources that spoke to the legislative history and social movement history of race and work laws during the New Deal. And what I found is that historians of Black equality sometimes call the body of laws enshrined in the 1930s that gave us our regime of employment and labor laws that most US workers enjoy today. They don't call it the New Deal, but sometimes the Old Deal or the Raw Deal. So why is this? Although in the language of rights, social welfare rights are often forcibly separated from anti-discrimination rights, early 20th century African-American leaders understood them to be one and the same. So the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded by sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, is traditionally associated with the US civil rights movement, but played an integral, and I might argue understudied role in the debate and development of Fair Deal and New Deal laws in the US. It's widely known that the NAACP and the National Urban League opposed the New Deal's facially neutral carve-outs for agricultural and domestic workers. Both sectors at the time were majority African-American workers, many of them the descendants of former slaves. And at the behest of Southern white Democrats who did not want to break up the South's plantation economy, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, and the National Labor Relations Act, while respectively providing for minimum wage, pension and disability, and laws securing the right to collectively organize and bargain, all of these laws excluded, through these sectoral carve-outs, 2/3 of African-American workers, many of whom were a single generation earlier slaves to their masters. Less well known, however, is the debates that over the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which preceded the New Deal. NIRA, as it was called, created the National Recovery Administration to oversee the nation's recovery from the Great Depression. The NRA was charged with stimulating the private sector economy and relieving economic security. And one of the ways that it did this was through the establishment of industry-specific price controls and wage codes. So African-American civil rights groups like the NAACP fought vociferously but failed to include enforceable anti-discrimination measures in these wage codes. These groups and their representatives feared that without an anti-discrimination provision, employers who were forced to pay a minimum wage would displace African-American workers with white workers. And in industries where wages were being established, industrialists submitted wage codes to the National Recovery Administration, which shamelessly included discriminatory provisions with reference to Black labor. So most of the codes provided in one manner or another a differential wage code of 20 to 40% less for Black workers. And these differential wages were not clearly seen as problematic by Black civil rights community members. For some, like Robert Moten, who was the principal of the historically Black Tuskegee Institute, a differential wage rate for Black workers was essential to ensure that Black workers kept their jobs. Moten endorsed a petition by the Southern Manufacturing Company in Alabama, which employed African-American workers, requesting an exemption from code regulations entirely. He feared that if industrialists were required by law to pay Black workers the same as white workers, then employers would fire the Black workers and replace them. So this is the often referenced threat of disemployment. You ask us to raise our wages, we'll lay people off. So in contrast, the NAACP vehemently opposed the petition and all differential wage rates based on race more broadly. They argued that the fight for socioeconomic equality would be crippled if there was a second tier of wages in which African Americans by law made less than their white counterparts. The NAACP and National Urban League submitted briefs arguing against differential wage rates during code hearings. And Robert Weaver, an African American leader and professor of economics who later became the US Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, wrote in 1934, and I quote, "The establishment of a lower minimum wage for Negroes would have far-reaching effects. It would destroy much of the advance Negroes had made in the industrial North. It would undermine the possibility of a racially diverse, strong, and effective labor movement in this nation. And the ultimate effect would be to relegate Negroes into a low-wage caste and place the federal stamp of approval upon their being in such a position." So though the National Recovery Administration was disbanded after NERA was ruled unconstitutional in 1935, the New Deal laws that followed, though facially neutral, ended up having similar racialized effects. As Charles Houston, a member of the NAACP, testified in relationship to the Social Security Act's exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers, said, the more the NAACP studied the bill, the more it began to look like a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Black workers to fall through. So with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which in the US gives us the minimum wage, the NAACP's policy preferences were influenced by their experiences with NERA. They supported a minimum wage and they opposed the exclusion of domestic and agricultural workers. They favored universal coverage, concerned that these carve-outs would map onto a racial wage rate differential. They argued in their 1937 annual report that this would be a concession to Southern states that would result in a special wage level for Black workers. And indeed, this is precisely what happened. Facially neutral terms that were utilized in the early 20th century New Deal laws helped to create and sustain generational poverty, particularly in the US South. The historic civil rights movement just 2 decades later attempted to address New Deal failures by pushing for better jobs for African Americans and demanding that discrimination in employment be explicitly outlawed. And in enshrining the liberal legal rights to be free from racial discrimination at work, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 aspired towards a US capitalist democracy that would, in theory, fully integrate Black workers and immigrants of color. Despite the aspirations of this new race-neutral equal opportunity order, racial violence continued to work normatively in any number of ways, not least of which was through the legacy of both slavery and New Deal worker carve-outs, which facilitated long-term wage differentials for most African American workers, contributing to what we call today the racial wage gap. So contextualizing Proposition 22 with this historical backdrop in mind, I argue that this law and others like it can be understood as a remarkable moment in the sea change of post-recession US capitalism and a continuation of this legacy of facially neutral wage carve-outs for a majority people of color workforce. And it is, I argue, drawing on the logic of the workers in my research, the new racial wage code. So unlike racial wage codes and carve-outs during the New Deal era, Proposition 22 and its progeny all over the world obscure the terms of the wage guarantee. First, the proposition takes away all employment rights, like unemployment insurance, workers' compensation if you're injured on the job, the minimum wage, so a guarantee for all to be paid for all the time that you labor, vehicle reimbursements, and overtime compensation, all which are clearly owed to these workers, especially in California after the passage of AB 5, which I can talk to you about in Q&A. The law then alleges to provide new benefits for the workforce, but it does this by attaching all of those benefits to a minimum number of hours related to this new fiction called engaged time. So in doing this, it invents this never before seen regulatory category for calculating wages. So what is engaged time? So engaged time is payment only after a worker has been allocated work, only after they've been dispatched work for by the company that they're laboring for. In the propaganda that preceded the passage of Proposition 22, company advertisements and company representatives said that the proposition would guarantee workers 120% of the minimum wage of the jurisdiction in which they were working. But what they fail to mention is that this wage guarantee only covers this engaged time, that is time after a worker is allocated work. Industry-sponsored research estimates that workers' non-engaged time, that is time for which they are not paid, just when they're waiting for work, is roughly 40% of all the time that they labor. But crucially, this amount of engaged time, of non-engaged time, is unpredictable. It's rooted not just in customer demand, as you might expect, but also in a black box of algorithmic decision-making that determines how and when any single worker is allocated work. So it's not just based on how much demand there is, where you're located, who the closest customer is. Instead, the determination is calculated through opaque and frequently changing formulas using granular data on location, individual behavior, demand, supply, and any number of other unknown factors. So this system of payment is made possible by dramatic changes in cloud computing that have taken place over just the past decade and machine learning technologies. And it pays workers, different workers, the different wages for the exact same work. So in contrast to other forms of variable pay, like bonuses or commissions that we're familiar with, what I've called algorithmic wage discrimination, that is how these workers are paid through Proposition 22, arises from and functions akin to the consumer-oriented practice of price discrimination, in which firms determine how much individual consumers are willing to pay based on acquired things like data about home prices and their location and their shopping habits over time, and then charge them accordingly. So based on what we understand about algorithmic wage price discrimination in the consumer context, we can postulate that wages under the system of how Uber is allowed to pay their workers because of this fiction of engaged time, we can postulate that wages are personalized based on what a firm's machine learning system knows about the habits, practices, and income targets of individual workers. And given the information asymmetry between workers and the firm, Proposition 22 allows companies like Uber to calculate the exact wage rates necessary to incentivize certain desired behaviors. So for example, if Ali works each day until he grosses $200, a firm's system can recognize this overtime and adjust his individual fares to make it take longer and longer to earn that same amount, keeping him on the road for longer. But workers, again, can only guess as to how much they might make or why they make what they do. So although Uber has long denied these allegations and my research, Dara Khosrowshahi the CEO admitted in an earnings call just a few weeks ago, he said, "We are actually targeting different trips to different drivers based on behavioral patterns that they're showing us. That really is the focus going forward, offering the right trip at the right price to the right driver." So post Proposition 22 in California, workers have told me that as they get closer to the number of engaged hours they need to get the benefits that they've supposedly earned, they stop receiving work altogether, thus making the so-called benefits attached to Proposition 22 unavailable to them. So their average wage dramatically different than the 120% of the minimum wage that the company said that they were going to get. Their average wage has been calculated at $6.20 an hour. To give you a sense of how little that is, the minimum wage in the area where I live is $17 an hour. So less than about one third of the minimum wage. And again, completely unpredictable, varies from day to day, varies from worker to worker. So in contrast to the New Deal industrialist who relied on a rhetoric of racial inferiority to justify differential wage codes and work law exclusions for Black workers, in the fight to pass Proposition 22 in California, the companies like Uber perversely relied upon a discourse of benevolent racial liberalism and imagined racial subjectivities. They benefited from explicitly racializing their workforce through campaign imagery and marketing. And I would just love to be able to show you some of this campaign imagery. So I'm going to try one more time to show you my PowerPoint. Give me 30 seconds. No, still doesn't want me to show you. Okay, well, you can look at it in my article, which is online in the Harvard Law and Policy Review. But they use these images of smiling Black and brown workers who the companies claimed needed and wanted the flexibility and independence that only this kind of work could offer, and that employment protections would supposedly preclude, which is, as we know, false, while simultaneously taking legal rights away from and lowering the wages of a racialized workforce. The companies activated tropes endemic to neoliberal racialization. They put up a single mom of color who needed flexible work, the immigrant father who couldn't make ends meet with his 3 other jobs, and said that these workers wanted a third category of work. The company's commercials attempted to internalize in voting consumers a form of sentimental compassion while making invisible the structural causes of racialized insecurity. The official anti-racism of Uber deployed not just through campaign imagery and company ads, but also through individual representatives like African-American former Obama appointees Anthony Fox and Tony West, endeavored to disconnect these capitalist developments in the app-deployed economy from racial injustice. And by focusing on particular liberal discursive forms of anti-racism, corporate diversity and anti-racism trainings for customer support operators, for example, the companies abstracted the ideal of racial equality from the bodies of African-American workers. So how did the gig workers respond to this? And I'll end here. So Uber drivers who fought Proposition 22 consistently revealed race to be a structuring force of gig work, both by pointing out the hypocrisies of the company's racial justice initiatives and by articulating how their everyday precarities were shaped by their race. In the historic wake of the police asphyxiation and killing of George Floyd, for example, driver leaders with Rideshare Drivers United connected their everyday life experiences with police brutality and wrote a public statement linking Black oppression to structural practices. The statement read in part, "As Uber and Lyft drivers, we are one of the largest Black workforces, and we are majority people of color and immigrants. Many of us also have experienced violence and harassment at the hands of police. As labor organizers and unionists, we organize not just for fair wages, but against racism and structural oppression in any force. These injustices are closely interwoven." For these workers, the coronavirus pandemic, like police brutality, also highlighted the ways in which the state had instrumentalized their bodies rather than caring for them. By executive order, ride-hail drivers were deemed essential, meaning they could work, continue to work, yet claims to their essentiality made to both the state and to the companies for which they worked went mostly unheard. And amidst so much injustice, instability, and struggles, workers turned to each other. So rooted in a politics of mutual aid, workers in California organized town halls and actions to fight Proposition 22. They held several we got your back personal protection equipment actions because the companies wouldn't even give them masks. They provided drivers with donated masks and other safety and cleaning equipment. They trained each other on how to appeal their unemployment insurance claims and to get the money that they were owed. And in the process, they communicated the dangers of the third category of worker in explicitly racial terms. At one town hall, an African-American driver articulated, "You cannot divide our bodies this way," alluding to the ways in which the experiences of African-Americans were acknowledged in some instances and not in others. On the one hand, the companies attested to knowing about and even working to address systemic racism. And on the other, they entrenched what drivers called a caste system, in which their workforce did not have the same protections as other low-income workforces. So building on these drivers' reflections and situating their analysis within this longer history of differential wage codes, I have argued today that facially neutral employment and labor right carve-outs for this highly racialized set of workers reproduces and is made possible by racial subjugation in the US. And as technology and capitalists attempt to spread this third category of worker to other parts of the world and the US, my hope is that this research makes legible through both history and ethnography, the ways in which this category is constituted by and through economic inequalities. Thank you.
With permission of Mr. Chairperson, I have some short words to say here, and with permission also of Professor Ana Virginia Gomes. Professor Vina, it's a great honor, a great pleasure to have you here with us. You are very welcome, albeit unfortunately, by mediatical measures. But anyway, we didn't give up the idea and the intention to have you face-to-face in the soon opportunity further on. But, well, after this brilliant presentation, I just would like to advise you that it's not mandatory, but I would say it's strongly recommended to read the Professor Vina's article, The New Racial Wage Code, which is published by the prestigious Harvard Law and Policy Review in, if not wrong, Professor Vina, 2022 or something like that. Well, very, very close to the nowadays approaching of this important, relevant, and challenging issue. Professor Vina, thank you. Thank you on behalf of the organizing committee, on behalf of the Department of Labor Law and Social Security, and of the grad studies program of the University of São Paulo School of Law. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I'm not there in person. It's very sad to me. So thank you again.
You'll be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vina. Now we will listen the Professor Ana Virginia Moreira Gomes, Deputy Director of the International Labor Organization for Latin America and Caribbean, professor in postgraduate program in constitutional law in the law course of the University of Fortaleza. She holds an LLM from the Faculty of Law of the University of Toronto, PhD in law from the USP, and postdoctoral degree from the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Professor Ana.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to say hello to Professor Freitas, and in his name to give a oi, and to all the organizers. I miss São Paulo very much and USP, and also to congratulate Professor Vina for a brilliant talk. I'm very excited to read her paper, and I want to start my talk from her talk, and It's a very, very important subject. I'm not a professor right now. I'm on leave. But before I start talking about the ILO, I will make a I will take a short leave as a professor, because during my academic career, I study a lot domestic work and self-employed workers like waste pickers. And legal segmentation of labor law is as old as labor law. The history of labor law in Latin America is the history of exclusion and excluding workers. And it's very important that we are discussing platform work. But I wish also that in this debate, especially in Latin America, we use this debate to include other workers that have always been excluded and are right outside on the streets, selling things, and are inside our houses doing domestic work. And they have always been also excluded from the employment relationship. And it's a problem for regulation. And we need a solution for that, a solution that includes all workers, not only platform workers, even though they are very important also. That's my point. And in my talk, not going back to my talk, I will talk about platform work and discrimination from a slightly different perspective. And with this, I want to add to the discussion. Professor Vina emphasized a very essential, central issue, which is this discrimination from the regulation perspective. That is the starting point. But I will focus on the discrimination that happens also at the platform work. And for this, I will base my talk on the report from the ILO. So I think I will use my my ILO perspective to contribute to the discussion here. And I will try to keep my time limit. So the platform work is on the ILO agenda, especially since the conference, the centenary conference, where there was the approval of the ILO Centenary Declaration. In the declaration, the ILO member states, they declare that it was essential to take measures to ensure personal data protection and privacy, and to respond to challenges and opportunities in the world of work, including platform work. After that, both the governing body and the ILO office took different measures, among them the expert meetings, and also the publication of a report entitled Realizing Decent Work in the Platform Economy, that is a base for a discussion that will happen in 2025 in the International Labor Conference, where the ILO member states will discuss a possible new ILO normative standard. This discussion will happen for 2 years in accordance to the ILO constitutional rules that fix that any normative standards should be discussed for 2 conferences. This report is very interesting because, and it's available at the ILO website, because not only it gives us a very broad context on the platform economy, but it also tries to answer the question of normative vacuum concerning platform work. The question is if we need or not a new normative standard concerning platform work. The initial point is that even though there are new characteristics or peculiarities on this type of work, maybe the regulatory challenge can be answered by the existing normative framework. But the other possibility is that there are challenges that cannot be answered by the existing normative framework and that we need new rules. So that's the question that the report poses to the member states. And that's the question that I will try to bring it here, especially in relation to the question of discrimination at platform work. So I will not try to talk here about platform work because I can imagine that this has already been discussed, but it's important to highlight that the report brings a very interesting overview of the platform economy, how it is heterogeneous, how it is distributed in the world, in the north and in the south, and how it organizes itself, and also how we can see the organization of workers. And I think that's very interesting also when we are thinking the type of regulation we might need. So the idea that there is a lot of heterogeneity and there is a lot of changing, it's very important when we think of the type of regulation, because it gives us, for example, a clue for the importance of collective bargaining and social dialogue in regulating this type of work. The report also deals with the nature of work on platforms, and it describes certain characteristics of platform work, for example, low entry barriers, flexibility, but it's very interesting for our discussion on discrimination, the role of algorithms in monitoring and supervising work. And I think in this debate, algorithms are really the defining characteristics. And they play a crucial role for our discussion. And they also are the key challenge for regulation in relation to discrimination, especially concerning monitoring and supervising work. Even though it's not only in the work on platforms, they are increasingly used as tools to enhance supervising and monitoring work in the platforms. It's not something new, the use of technology, but the possibilities, how they are used in platform work are on a level that we can only imagine. And they can be used in many different forms and the change is being effective in a very, very changing context. I will focus now on the regulatory framework, going back to our initial question on this, if there is a need for a new normative standard. So the report initially looked at the ILO normative framework, the ILO own conventions, and starting by the Fundamental Conventions, number 100, the Equal Remuneration Convention, and the Convention 111, and both the Discrimination on Employment and Occupation Convention. And both conventions apply to all workers, both nationals and non-nationals in all sectors of activity, in the public and private sectors, in the formal and informal economy. The report also cites the Workers with Family Responsibilities Convention, number 156, and this convention also applies to all branches of economic activity in all categories of workers. The Committee of Experts of the ILO has emphasized that all workers should be covered, whether they're full-time, part-time, temporary, or other forms of employment, and whether they are in wage or non-wage employment. Specifically about equality and non-discrimination, the report concludes that there does not appear to be a gap in terms of scope of application of these relevant normative standards. But the prevention of discriminatory bias in the use of algorithms in the context of platform work appears to be a gap. And this was mentioned in the meeting of experts on decent work in the platform economy. So what is the conclusion? Even though the ILO fundamental conventions and other important normative standards do not exclude explicitly, include platform workers, because include all types of workers, it appears to be a normative gap in the prevention of discriminatory bias in the use of algorithms in the context of platform work, because these standards do not appear to have an adequate response to this specific regulatory challenge. This is what we can conclude. Finally, the report cites the Convention 190, which is a very innovative convention that also applies to all workers and other persons in the world of work. It's a very inclusive convention, and its scope does not appear to give rise to a gap in the application of self-employed workers. Therefore, it also covers platform workers. In relation to the broader context of equality and non-discrimination, the report recognizes that platform work can provide opportunity for workers, for example, to combine work and family responsibilities, but it can, for example, reinforce gender roles and inequalities. Can also increase the risk of cyber harassment, while some research suggests that women are more likely to be a target. Among workers, platform workers, the report cites that there is a gender pay gap and also occupational segregation based on gender. with women more likely to perform cleaning and care service, while men are more likely to work in passengers, transportation, and delivery services. Finally, the substitution of management supervision with customer reviews has also given rise to concern that these practices perpetuate existing societal biases and stereotypes. Moreover, algorithms use unbalanced or biased data, and they are likely to generate unbalanced and biased output. Algorithms could offer the potential for neutral outcome and to reduce discrimination, but in some cases, they are producing the opposite effect. And there are studies that are pointing, for instance, gender and racial discrimination. And this is exactly what the expert meeting has pointed out as a challenge that does not has met any response from the normative standards. But the inform also cites some country and regional initiatives, normative initiatives that have been taken to try to prohibit discrimination arising from the use of algorithms. Some countries have established safeguards to require human oversight of decisions arising from use of algorithms, as well as ensuring provision of information to and consultation with workers' representatives in this area. And I will cite some here. For example, Chile, in my region, Latin America, platforms are required to respect the principle of equality and non-discrimination and to take measures to avoid any type of discrimination among workers related to assignment of work, bonus, and incentives, and calculation of remuneration. In some cases, the platforms are required to disclose the decision-making criteria used by the algorithms, which can create greater transparency and reduce the possibility of discrimination. So transparency here is a key word. Another example is Spain. Platforms in workers in the transport sector have the right to be informed of the parameters, rules, and instructions on which algorithms or AI systems are based that affect decision-making, that may affect working conditions, access, and maintenance of employment. So another key word here is information, the right to be informed. So transparency, the right to be informed. Croatian is another example. Employment contracts must include additional information on the manner of making decisions, because of course, the peculiarity on platform work is because the algorithm is not transparent, the worker might not even know that she is being discriminated. Draft legislation in Uruguay also requires digital platforms to respect the principle of equality and non-discrimination in the implementation of algorithms. So to make this type of rule effective, the rule needs to be able to guarantee transparency. How? One way to do this is to secure that the worker have the right to be informed. The report also cites some case law. In Italy, for example, a court found that algorithm scheduling by a platform that downgraded workers access to work time slots due to absences for reasons such as strike action, health, or family care responsibilities was discriminatory. So the idea is that this type of legislations try to give more transparency, which may reduce the risks of discriminations, particularly in relation to the role of algorithms in decision-making. But the report concludes that wider protections are not common. Most of the rules are very specific. Another example is the new agreement on the EU directive that also, in the case of algorithmic management, try to secure a review by humans in the case of platform work. And also guaranteeing a human supervision of the automized systems and with the participation of workers' representatives and the right to be informed of the evaluation made on the supervision systems and on the decision-making systems done by the platform company. So the automized system of supervision has to go through an evaluation. This evaluation has to be human and has to count with the participation of workers, representatives, who also have the right to be informed of this evaluation. So in this type of regulation, the access to information is crucial. So therefore, the anti-discrimination rules to be effective should use the concept of transparency that in its turn should use the access to information from workers. I think that's a very important point that it's made both by the ILO report and also in the European Union example. The ILO report concludes that transparency disclosure provisions can reduce the possibility of discrimination. And there are consequences of a lack of transparency in contractual relationships. And that algorithms give rise to a number of transparency questions in relation, for example, to fair allocation of work and possibility of discriminatory bias, the quantity and timing of work made available to workers, the calculation of remuneration, rating of the workers, sanctions, deactivation of workers from a platform. So this lack of disclosure about the nature of the data collected by algorithms and what this information is used for, which has also been identified as a barrier to workers exercising agency over their work. So transparency is central. The right to be informed is essential, and participation in decision-making is essential. The report cites different regulatory initiatives by countries, and I invite you all to take a look in the examples. But it also says that countries are going through a very intense process right now of regulation and discussion through social dialogue about regulation. Meanwhile, the discussion at the ILO is supposed to take place in 2025. One interesting among many that the report cites example is from Canada, in Ontario. So in Ontario, the regulation is such that it foresees that within 24 hours of an individual being given access to a digital platform, the law will require them to be provided with information about how the remuneration is calculated, pay periods, how work is assigned, whether the platform uses any performance measurement system, and if the performance measurements produce consequences for a worker, and the nature of such consequences. So it's a very detailed type of rule. The report concludes that this type of measures to promote greater transparency help to tackle discrimination and also transparent dispute resolution and contract termination process. These interventions place minimal disclose requirements on platforms relating to how algorithms are used and what must be disclosed in contracts, independent of the nature of the contract. But the technological changes will continue at a very fast rhythm, and other transparency issues are likely to grow. And sometimes it's very difficult for the law to keep pace with these technological changes. So collective bargaining and social dialogue have a very important role in this type of regulation. And therefore, I want to emphasize here the very important role of workers, representatives, and in this matter. And I know that tomorrow or this afternoon, sorry, I have seen that this is a debate. During the last governing in March, we had the governing body session of the ILO, and we have had one meeting where there was a discussion on digitalization of work. And we had academia, we had representative of open AI, different companies, etc. But a common theme of all of them was how fast technology is involved, changing, and how collective bargaining was a very, very adequate type of space for keep up with these changes. And I want to put this on the table also, and how important is for these workers to have a legitimate and adequate representation so they can be part on this dialogue and through effective collective bargaining and social dialogue also. I think I will end here, and I want to thank you the invitation and saudar Professor Freitas, and thank you the organizers.
No, just a short comment about the unintended effect or byproduct of using algorithm for discrimination. I mean, putting aside the intended use of algorithm to produce discrimination, which is a felony, which is a crime that should be submitted to criminal prosecution. There is a possibility to identify the use of algorithm and algorithm decisions like intrinsically, inevitably discriminatory. Likewise, we have some evidences, probably Ana Virginia remember, the use of seniority shop, the discriminatory use of seniority shop. As we have a country or society historically very discriminatory, we have this historic discrimination. As we use seniority shop, to a certain extent, we can reestablish some backward statute of discriminatory relationship. This is just to take into consideration, to take into account. There is probably something very close to this. Using algorithm, despite of not intentionally for discriminatory purpose, can be itself discriminatory because it's retrospective, it's backward. And if we have a historically discriminatory society, it can, to a certain extent, re-establish some discriminatory patterns in the past. So I thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for this awkward subversion that I ordinarily do. I think we could just yes. Meanwhile, I'll try to fix the presentation PowerPoint here.
Thank you, Professor Ana Virginia. And now we listen to Professor Adriana Reis de Araújo, Public Labor Prosecutor, PhD degree in Labor Law from University Complutense Madrid, Master degree in Social Relations from Catholic Faculty of São Paulo, PUC São Paulo, Professor of Labor Law in School of Federal Public Prosecutions.
Let me see if I can just a bit patient. In order to Adriana, could you help me? I think we have to go inside the system again. This is like this. Mas o Zoom tá aqui. Ah, yes. So go to Zoom.
Vai lá,
So
tela
this,
aberta,
and
vai
this one.
compartilhar,
Share screen. Oh, good.
coloca
You're
a
approaching. Here.
Coloca em full mode.
Full mode here. This one.
Isso.
Did you get it?
Esse foi.
Once more? Did you get it? It's okay? It's okay. Thank you so much. Nope. Not yet.
Tem que colocar em full mode ali também.
If you want to, it's not exactly necessary.
Tem que tirar daqui. Deixar no cantinho. Assim, bem no cantinho.
Não chego lá.
Foi full mode aí?
Não consigo chegar lá. Negocinho. Baixa o negócio. Aí deixa essa barra preta.
Espera aí. Deixa na apresentação dela. Não, não, aqui transmite aquela ali. Aí deixa eu só colocar aqui em full mode, pegar o D que eu aprendi que faz isso. Cadê o zoom do Freitas? Aqui, ver se agora vai. Sim, agora sim, tá melhor.
Tem uma barrinha.
Sim, agora tá melhor. Vou pôr só pôr para cá que aparecem as fotos. Pode começar.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you to discuss about algorithmic discrimination. And of course, I know the subject of this event is gig economy, but to talk about gig economy, I think it's much better for us to, not much better, but it's necessary to dive into the algorithmic discrimination, okay? In order also to realize how can the algorithm produce discrimination, because as the professor Freitas said, the problem is not just an algorithm that gets input and intentionally is discriminated, but the problem is when the algorithm impact is discrimination against minorities, even though the input are not discrimination on itself, okay? So I'd like to congratulate to Professor Antônio Rodrigues Freitas and Elizabeth Tippett for promoting this important debate. I'd like to thank Adriana Calvo for the invitation. And for me, it's an honor to be here sharing this panel with Professor Vina, Marco Aurelio Serral, and Ana Virginia. To begin my subject, I want to dive on human cognition bias. So that's the next slide, please. The human cognition bias can be distributed on many categories. I've chosen 8 of them. The first one, the group attribute bias, is the propensity to attribute a certain individual inference to everyone from a group indistinctly. Sorry. For example, images search system for occupation slightly exaggerates gender and racial stereotypes. Most of the images for CAO, president, or politicians are white men in suit. Most of human rights and environmental activists are women, Black people, LGBT people, or indigenous. The selection bias occurs when the samples are not representative of the population. This can happen organically when working with small sets of information or when the sampling methodology is not truly randomized. For instance, a selection of images that associates names or places to a specific gastronomy taste, like Paola Valentini pasta, João da Silva beans and rice, Hans Schmidt Eisbein, or recruitment selection exclusively based on previous profiles of the company's employees. Another one is the implied bias. Implied bias points to the inference connected to the mental and memory models of the individual. For example, in Brazil, brides are on white dresses only or mainly, but in India, usually they wear red dresses. The confirmation bias refers to the collection or development of a data system in a way that confirms the prior beliefs of the individual. For example, on social media, users see what they already believe and are left with the feeling that their views are supported in reality. The availability bias occurs when the bias corresponds to the experience available for the individual. It reinforces how users view the world despite not all data being investigated and weighted equally. The survivor bias reveals human influence to focus on the characteristics of winners due to the lack of visibility of other samples, confusing our ability to discern correlation and cause. Social bias is defined as discrimination for or against a person or group or a set of ideas or beliefs in a way that is prejudicial or unfair. It often involves consciously or unconsciously stereotyping others and behaving in a way that disadvantages a person or group or advantages another. For example, Facebook and Google make most of their money from online advertising. The researchers from Data et al. Simulated internet users who declared to be male or female. Google showed simulated male ads for a career coaching agencies that promised large salaries more frequently than the simulated female. Automation bias is the propensity for humans to favor suggestion from automated decision-making systems and to ignore contradictory information made without automation, even if it is correct. That happens because of people's consideration that those recommendations are rational or infallible, but also because they try to minimize their own responsibility on the result. So I'm gonna illustrate a little about using some homeless data in Brazil. In 2020, the IPEA, Brazilian Economic Research Institute, found that there were around 221,000 homeless people in Brazil. From September 2012 to March 2020, this number increased by 140%, mostly due to the COVID pandemic. About 71% of the homeless people were workers that couldn't afford rent. Currently, there are around 243,000 people living on the streets in Brazil, and 69% of them are Black. These facts highlight the staggering reality. Constituting 56% of the total population, Afro-Brazilians are disproportionately affected by poverty. When we can see the homeless issue for another perspective, 29% of the LGBT community leaves home before they reach the age of 15, and 49% before the age of 20. This represents a departure significantly earlier than the national average. Moreover, most of them were expelled by homophobic families and may commonly end up on the street. In Fortaleza, for example, 8% of homeless people stated to be LGBT, and 20% didn't want to reveal their sexual preference for the IPEA researchers. Next. Because of the group attitude bias, many people believe that the main cause to end up on the street is drug or alcohol addiction, even though a larger part of it is result of unemployment and familial issues. Combined, they consist of a total of 60% of the causes. The homeless gap of fundamental rights are the result of low-level education, poverty, informal work conditions, and low incomes, prejudice, exclusion, less access to public financial support and social service, traps this group on a loop of poverty. The data on homeless is merely estimative due to the group's distrust towards public officials Interactions between the homeless and authorities are often marked by violence, harassment, health and social assistance denial, removal of their belongings, and eviction from urban areas. The PEA research relied on the available public benefits and services data only. Because of the selection bias, the homeless individuals who do not access these services, the ones we can easily encounter on the streets, remain invisible to public policy. The government services or support offers are limited on just one homeless profile, so it creates a biased system. Certainly, that debilitates any effectiveness of the public actions and also discriminate against the most vulnerable group. So, the homeless data in Brazil illustrate some of the challenges and the biases on the system input and output. It is similar to an algorithm-based system. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are based on data and algorithms. What that means is they can work with all the data available on the internet, sites, social media platforms, or even a reduced offline database. Let's think about an algorithm that works with big data, the large and diverse database sets that are huge in volume and also rapidly grow in size over time. Let's think about traffic data, for instance. Traffic data must be produced by individuals that have any mobile device connected to the internet on their outside routine or by a public digital surveillance system. As we narrow down the data sources and amplify its inputs, we can increase the accuracy of the information. The information about the traffic routine of some smartphone customer, for example, can be much more precise. Undoubtedly, the amount of personal data of someone who actively engages on social media, credit card operations, digital platforms, lives in the smart cities with smart objects at home, are much more specific, precise than someone who lives in a remote countryside without smart devices. In the case of wearable devices, smartwatches, for example, the acquisition is uninterrupted and strongly invasive, producing an enormous quantity of sensible data of its user, such as health and habits. These examples illustrates under and over data inputs, and all of them can be algorithm-based. The choice between big or narrow data sources depends on the goals of the system. Despite big data being huge and constantly growing, it's not and will never be universal. There is much more information and data from people, territory, history, and culture from the central economies. As we noticed by the comparison of the homeless population data, big data can also have an implicit or intentional lack of information that is the result of inequality, invisibility, violence, or harassment of minorities. This disproportional information can lead to discriminatory algorithms and to an unfair or illegal output of any artificial intelligence and machine learning system. Definitely, another. The algorithms are seen as rational, neutral, and unbiased, but the disparate distribution of data and technology reveals that it is false. Algorithm is an abstract formalized description of a computational procedure. In the fourth industrial revolution, algorithms are strongly based on digital data. From big data, Internet of Things, and networking, the algorithm discrimination came out by the harmful effects from the algorithm decision-making on minorities. Next. The algorithm decision-making is an abstract formalized description of a computational procedure that produces an output. It can be fully or only partially automated. That's easy to understand. Partly automated is the one that use that assists humans on decision making. There are some kind of human intervention. Fully automated, there's not. The algorithms are not inherent bad or discriminatory. However, they ignore all the obstacles that minorities face on a day-to-day. If this society excludes part of the population by their ethnicity, gender, sexual preference, disability, age, origin, the data it produces reflects that. In Brazil, for example, the gender violence rates are huge. It occupies the 5th position among countries of higher rates of gender-based murder. This gender violence is reproduced on online interaction. According to the Brazilian Online Violence Observatory from University of Brasilia, 75% of the violence on the internet are against women between ages of 14 to 35, and 40% of the victims are students. In 85% of the cases, the aggressor is a man of ages between 26 and 35. The gender cyber violence reached chatbots, even the ones with no image or voice, just text, or it just have to have a female name. The chatbot Bia from Bradesco, for instance, Bia from Bradesco Bank was offended more than 95,000 times in 2020. The chatbot Lu from Magazine Luiza was victim of sexual harassment. The UNESCO campaign, Hey, Update My Voice, has encouraged women to answer the sexist attacks, updating the chatbot repertoire. Brazilian women faces the same violence and gender obstacles as well in the workplace. Mentorrupting, prove it again, the conflict between housework and glamour work, tightrope, maternity wall, and of course, sexual and moral harassment. On these work conditions, an algorithm decision-making based exclusively on performance can discriminate against women, pregnant women, women with familial responsibilities. Instead of universal output, the algorithms need to reduce the society complexity of data collection and training bases tends to result on privilege for the dominant individual model, the heterosexual white man with no disability. Thanks to this bias, algorithms can tie up organizations into disparate practices. Sometimes even the expert doesn't understand how the system got a particular result, as there was no protected data input as gender, sexual preference. The bias is on the filter, on the pattern select for the algorithm to work on. The experts must review the correlations the system made, whether they lay on relationships or patterns to identify the origin of the bias output. The risk can be illustrated with algorithmic decision-making used to select students, employers, and customers. In the 80s, a medical school in Utah detected that the student selection system discriminated against women and people of immigrant backgrounds. The system was trained with the admission files from earlier years and merely reflect what was already in the system. Algorithmic bias refers to the systemic and repeatedly errors in a computer system that creates unfair outcomes, such as privileging one arbitrary group or users over another. So, the repeatable errors from an algorithm bias imposed conscious or unconsciously by unequal and exclusionary society models perpetuates prejudice, inequality, and poverty for the most vulnerable groups. Even the fact that currently the United States and China are leaders of artificial intelligence and machine learning and their products are applied in different ethnic, cultural, economic, and social contexts can produce illegal and unfair outputs. The conclusion is that the algorithm and platforms, mainly the decision-making, can be a threat to minorities and demand a high level of protection by the law and practice against discrimination. Go on, please. Quanto tempo? How? Okay. Okay. So let's see how data training and validation works. And I'm gonna take facial recognition as an example. The algorithm, it's not. Go back, please. The algorithm discrimination dynamics more complex than merely a reproduction of historical, social, and cultural bigotry. The data must be trained and validated for the system to work on it. As example, analyzing the steps for a RF system, we find step 1, an image of a person's face is captured from a photo or video. Step 2, facial recognition software analyzes the geometry on the face, identifying factors such as the distance between the eyes and the distance from the forehead to the chin. Thus, a facial signature is created based on the identification of facial reference points. Step 3 consists on comparing the facial signature, which is nothing more than a mathematical formula, to a database of known faces pre-collected and stored. Step 4, the determination stage takes place, in which verification or identification of the analyzed face can occur. To evaluate each algorithm's performance on its task, it's necessary to measure the two classes of error the software can make. Next, false positives and false negatives. A false positive means that the software wrongly considers photos of two different individuals to show the same person, while a false negative means the software failed to match two photos that, in fact, do show the same person. Some adversities may occur in the recognition process, such as local lighting, use of glasses, tattoos on the face scars. The data that is less readable or that cannot be known about users is left out or roughly approximately by the algorithms. According to Balka, the information system inescapably produces shadow bodies by emphasizing some aspects of subjects and ignoring others. These entities proliferate throughout information systems, and the differences that separate the anticipate user from the concrete user can be problematic. For instance, according to a study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology that evaluated the algorithms of 18,000 million images of 8 million people from operation databases provided by the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and FBI, the facial recognition system works better for white men. So the photos were really good ones, not any kind of photos, but good ones. And even though that there were failed to recognize non-white men. Among US developed algorithms, there were similar high rates of false positives in one-to-one matching for Asian, Africans, and Native groups. The American Indian demographic had the highest rates of false positives. On the other hand, among some algorithms developed in Asian countries, there were no such dramatic differences in false positives in one-to-one matching between Asian and Caucasian faces. The reason may be the relationship between an algorithm's performance and the data used to train it, as it is estimated that more diversity training data may produce more equitable outcomes. It is imperative for developers to use such data. The biggest problem with most algorithms used in facial recognition technologies is the misidentification of non-white and non-male faces. The lack of accuracy on RF data, training and validation are responsible for much of algorithm racial and gender disparate treatment or impact. As many of the RF systems are used for foreshadowing policing to identify likely targets for police intervention or solve crimes, the number of false positive face recognition defendants or recidivists on non-white people will be higher. Then we got the exact reproduction of racist practices on the decision-making algorithm. In Brazil, 9% around of those arrested by facial recognition systems are Black. Bahia leads the number of police approaches and arrests using the new technique, 51% of arrests, followed by Rio, 37%, Santa Catarina, 7%, Paraíba, 3%, Ceará, 0.7%. Otherwise, the efficiency of this system is questionable. For example, during Carnival on 2019, in the 4 days of Micareta in Feira de Santana, the video surveillance system captured the faces of more than 1.3 million people, generating 903 alerts, which resulted in the fulfillment of 18 warrants and in the arrest of 15 people. That is, all the alerts issued, more than 96% resulted in nothing. Tarcísio Silva, Master in Contemporary Communication Culture by University of Bahia and Tech Policy Senior Fellow on Mozilla Foundation, warns that the irresponsible use of supposedly natural databases for training without filtering or full human curation promotes colonial and patriarchal practices, the worst in society, as he says. Even in data collection, he affirms that algorithm racism is a kind of updated structural racism whose maintenance produce advantages in favor of an hegemonic group, deeply dependent on an epistemology of ignorance to maintain power, as his words. Furthermore, the facial recognition system that fails Black people and women can be an unsurmountable obstacle to reach some services, such as opening a bank account. The false negative output is not only an inconvenience, it can overcome opaque barriers for a community that already is discriminated against. Therefore, the sources of algorithm discrimination are under or over data representation, data selection, data training and validation, model design, different accuracy levels, and no diversity on the developer's team. Next, please. The underrepresentation of certain social groups in innovation centers and teams also implies a biased algorithm. Usually, the high-tech companies are dominated by heterosexual white men, and statistics prove that the US and Brazil share similar critical standards. In 2016, none of the top 10 Silicon Valley technology firms employed a single Black woman, or only a few employed any Black employees. In 2021, 8% of the US labor force was employed in technology. Women hold only 26% of tech employment, while men hold 73% of these positions. For the same position, at the same business, with the same experience, women in tech are typically paid 3% less than men. White Americans hold 62% of the positions in the US tech sector. Asian Americans account for 20% of jobs, Latin Americans 8%, and Black Americans 7%. 83% of tech executives in the US are white. In comparison of other industries, the high-tech sector employs more men, Asian Americans, and white people. The high-tech sector employs fewer Black Americans, Latin Americans, and women than in the other sectors as a whole. In 2023, 9% of the startups of Silicon Valley were founded by women. The highest women participation on startups foundation was 26% in 2019. In Brazil, Preta Lab, a Brazilian mapping platform for Black and Indigenous women in technology, found out that in 2019, 68% of technology professionals are men, while women make up 31%, and intersex people 0.3%. White people represent 58% of the professionals, compared to 37% of Black people, 4% of yellow people, and 0.3% of indigenous. 32% of the technology companies had non-Black people on these teams, and 68% of the people in color or Black people, I'm meaning Black people because in Brazil we use this term. The Black people were 10% maximum of the members. 95% had no indigenous, 85% no person with disabilities, and 62% no mothers. The majority of them declared to be heterosexual, 79%, followed by 10% of homosexual, 8% bisexual, and 2% pansexual. The Brazilian, so that's the scenario. And how about our law? I start with the Brazilian Constitution. The Brazilian Constitution considers equality as a supreme value of a fraternal, pluralist, and unprejudiced society. It is fundamental for a democratic state founded on social harmony and committed to the peaceful settlement of disputes. So it's in our preamble. Equality, inequality, discrimination, non-discrimination are repeated along the text of the Constitution many times. And the other one. Originally, the Constitution didn't define discrimination. The definition was in the international treaties that were incorporated in our regulation as the 111th ILO Discrimination Convention. Although the approval of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2008 in a qualified quorum of 3/5 of the votes of the respective members of each house of the National Congress incorporated its concept as a constitutional amendment. So let's see the definition on the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Discrimination on the basis of disability means any distinction, exclusion, restriction on the basis of disability which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others, all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. We can replace disability by any other protected characteristic, such as gender, race, religion, origin, and so on. The discrimination can be of two different orders. Direct discrimination or disparate treatment is described as the difference in the treatment of persons in analogous or relevantly similar situations, which is based on an identifiable characteristic. It must be known and it must be intentional. Undirected discrimination or disparate impact means that a practice which seems neutral at first glance ends up discriminating against people of a certain ethnic origin or other protected characteristic. For indirect discrimination, it is not relevant whether the alleged discriminator intends to discriminate. It is the effect of a practice that counts. Therefore, discriminators cannot evade the prohibition of indirect discrimination by proving that they didn't mean to discriminate. Algorithm system can cause both discrimination. For example, algorithm decision making could breach the prohibition of indirect discrimination if an algorithm system rejects job applications letters from a disproportionate number of people with a certain ethnicity. Additionally, organizations could use algorithms to discriminate on purpose. For instance, a firm that wanted to discriminate against people of a certain ethnicity could discriminate on the basis of a proxy that correlates with that ethnicity, such as postal code. This dynamic is called algorithmic redlining. The victim must show that the algorithm discriminated. However, algorithm systems are often opaque for several reasons. For instance, most people lack the technical expertise to understand how such systems arrive at decisions. Even the experts who have built an algorithm system may not know how that system will behave when used in practice and is fed certain data. In addition, trade or state secrets may hinder obtaining information about algorithm system. Because of the lack of transparency of algorithm decisions, it is hard for people to realize the disparate treatment and to access whether they were discriminated against. It is even harder to prove that a seemingly neutral rule, practice, or decision disproportionately affects a protected class and is thus prima facie discriminatory. If the alleged discriminator discriminator successfully evokes an objective justification for the disproportional impact, the prohibition of indirect if the alleged discrimination successfully evokes an objective justification for the disproportional impact, the prohibition of indirect discrimination does not apply. In conclusion, the indirect discrimination can remain hidden for both the organization or the victim. Next. Let's take a look on the data protection law. Data protection law aims to defend fairness and human rights when organizations use personal data. Data protection law grants rights to people whose data are being used, data subjects, and impose obligations on organizations that use personal data, data controllers. Data subjects refer to any individual data subject refers to any individual who can be identified directly, indirectly, via an identifier such as name, ID number, location, factors specific to the person's physical, psychological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, and social identity. The Brazilian Constitution grants privacy, private life, honor, and image of person as a fundamental right, and ensures the right to compensation for poverty or moral damage resulting for their violation. The definitions and obligations are disposed on in the law 13,709 for 2018, well known as LGPD. The core of Brazilian data protection law consists of 7 principles, which can be summarized as the follow. First one, personal data may only be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently, and the organization must guarantee for the data subject the right to obtain in free request knowledge of them. Such data may only be collected for a purpose that is specified in the advances and should only be used for purposes that are compatible with the original purpose. Organizations should not collect or use more data than necessary. Organization must ensure that such data are sufficiently accurate and up to date. Organizations should not operate data for discriminatory or abusive goals. Organizations must ensure that data security and must prevent damage on its operation. The organization that determines the purpose and means for processing is responsible for compliance. In 2022, the data protection was used to prohibit the subway company for installing RF to identify missing people and increase security on its lines in São Paulo. The public security services intended this new monitoring system to trigger an alert whenever a person is identified. At first, the Court of Justice in São Paulo blocked its installation for violating privacy based on LGPD, despite the high cost of the system, around $10 million. On a second glance, the court authorized collecting biometric data as security matters are an exception on the consent need. As the metro in São Paulo is partially private, the same court prohibited the use of facial recognition system used in online 4 by Via 4, the company in charge of it. And it fined this company for $100,000 for using the system on marketing and private purpose. The company installed interactive doors with facial and emotional detection for personalized advertising. The judicial decision was based on the obligatory individual consent for personal data operations presented on LGPD. The dismissal of human intervention on decision-making algorithm fully automatized reduced the possibilities to avoid this algorithm discrimination. In this hypothesis, the algorithm transparency for the data subject can be useless for most people because of the lack of technical expertise to understand how much system arise at decision. The public data authority supervision on data controllers is permitted just in case of the denial to inform the data subject is sustained by public or traded secrets. So what we should do, I'm finishing my explanation. First of all, choose for relevant bias. First of all, we must analyze the biases and its importance on the context of its use. For instance, gender is relevant on medical diagnosis, but it's not for an employment decision. Second, impose human review on fully automated operation, as in general, the more automated and less human intervention a system has, the bigger is the unexpected negative effects. Embrace dynamic to interrupt bias, unless the bias will perpetuate. Interrupter bias changes the basic business system in order to stop a pattern of bias in its track. The developers must take three steps. Determine whether there's a problem. That must happen by impact report. Step 2, identify key metrics, period, actions, goals, and database. Step 3, experiment measures success. And I add a fourth step. As the bias interpretation is complex and demands the removal of many biased layers, it takes time and effort to overcome it. So the fourth step is adjust and keep trying until the problem is solved. Also, promote diversity in technology in industry. In general, the actions forward change are restricted to token hires, as we saw, 10% of the group. Often offer sensitive trainings for teams, set up mentoring network for minority representatives, but the diversity promotion requires the CAO's commitment. The CAO must decide that the diversity is imperative, otherwise it will less likely disappear. Diversity must be widespread in all the organization, in the sector for human resources, developer team, marketing, and so on. Spread trustfully information about algorithm, AI, and machine learning society. I show you a picture of a book that is online on the site of the Public Ministry Officer site. You can download it freely. It's an example, and what we are doing here, another one. Create action protocols on and offline against violence and harassment. Promote affirmative actions like developing gender-neutral job advertisements, guidelines, blinded resume, guarantee diversity on hiring personnel sector. Improve regulation. Finally, as we still don't have a specific regulation on artificial intelligence, the fields of anti-discriminatory law and data protection law should be more explored against algorithm direct or indirect discrimination. There still are few cases in Brazilian courts. Of course, the self-regulation for ethical AI uses can be stimulated to mitigate discrimination and provides inspirations for the legislators. However, as the self-regulation is no binding and disparate treatment or impact violates human rights, it's imperative the Parliament approves a specific regulation against algorithm discrimination on AI and machine learning. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Adriana Reis. Through the conference presented, we observed the technological changes brings new regulatory problems and aggravates others, which already now, which are notorious in a society like Brazilian society, strongly marked by several and different types of discrimination and inequality, racism, gender, etc. So I thank these magistral conferences and declare this panel for closed. Thank you.
A final message for all of you. Today at 4:30, we're going to have the plenary. The plenary will be with all American professors. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, telling their opinion about the future of work and the future of gig economy. And after we hear all the opinions of them, we're going to open for questions. So please, please come here at 4:30 because we need you to be here to be in the audience, judges, for this great opportunity, okay? Now the ceremony is going to have another message for you.
Now we're going to have a quick lunch break. We're going to resume our activities at 2:30 with the seminar of platform work in unions with Mrs. Carolina Zedes, Samuel Streicher, and André Gonçalves Zipperer. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, Vina. Thank you, Anna.
Tchau.
Here.
Obrigada. Thank you.
Great pleasure to have you here in this panel, which was
Tchau,
fantastic.
Adriana. Tchau,
Thank you.
Freitas. Bye, bye.
Bye-bye.